Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick: People, Probabilities, and Big Moves to Beat the Odds. Written by Chris Bradley, Martin Hurt, and Sven Smith. Performed by David Marantz.
Visual aids found in the print edition of this book are available to you as a downloadable PDF. To access this file, please click the link on the product page where you purchased this title. Thank you.
Introduction. Welcome to the Strategy Room. In the Strategy Room, human bias and social dynamics can prevent the necessary big moves from getting on the table, let alone getting executed. In this book, we arm ourselves with hard data from thousands of companies to take the social side of strategy head on. Isn't there another way? We hear that all the time, and you must have asked yourself that question too, probably more than once. Perhaps after an exhausting marathon of strategy sessions that are supposed to be discussions, but really are just presentations. Perhaps after feeling compelled to say yes to another investment proposal with uncertain prospects. Perhaps after one of the usual discussions to reallocate resources to growth opportunities that go nowhere. Over decades of working with hundreds of the most senior business leaders around the world, we agreed there has to be another way. Books about improving the strategy process fill our shelves, packed with frameworks and anecdotes that claim to crack the code of successful strategy. As interesting as these books are to read, as inspiring as their case examples are, it seems we are still short a breakthrough. Today's strategic challenges are in fact very similar to what they've been over the ages, despite the serious efforts of a lot of smart people. This book belongs on a different shelf. Rather than relying on the traditional approach of best practices and inspiring anecdotes, we use broad and deep empirical research. We have identified a small number of performance levers that, according to the factual evidence we compiled and our experience in implementing them, can be used to greatly increase your odds of success. We believe we've also found the one often overlooked factor responsible for many of the conundrums facing us in the strategy room. The one factor that has perplexed generations of business leaders, the factor that causes so many strategies to not work out as planned. That factor is what we call the social side of strategy. In this book, we use empirical insights to finally help you and other business leaders chart a course to address the social side of strategy, and as a result, develop better, bigger, bolder strategies. There is another way. You are not alone. As we begin our journey together through the empirics and the social side of strategy, let's peer into the strategy room and look at some of the scenes playing out there. These scenes probably feel familiar to you because they are surprisingly common, despite all those books and articles about how to get to better strategy, better decisions, and better business performance. As the strategy process starts, the team agrees that this year you will avoid huge documents with 150 slides and endless appendices. You commit to having real conversations about the future of the business and the tough choices you'll have to make. Then, 2 days before the first meeting, 3 of those 150-page documents land in the CEO's inbox with a thud. So much for real conversations. You are back wading through details in carefully scripted presentations that numb the senses before anybody has a chance to fully grasp the content. Or you decide that you need to have a deep strategic rethink after a stretch of indifferent results. The top team agrees on a change in direction. The board approves. Then the CFO takes over and turns that vision into a first-year budget. The boldness oozes away as those who stand to lose resources mount rear-guard actions and as other immune responses to real changes kick in. Somehow, that bold rethink produces a new budget that looks a lot like last year's budget. It's back to business as usual. How about a third scenario? The strategy is agreed on. It all looks good on paper, and there is loads of compelling backup. But somehow, deep down, everybody senses that the strategy is nothing more than hopeful thinking. It is a little too kind to the egos of the people who made it, and a little too unwilling to embrace the harsh reality of competition. People 2 or 3 levels down in the organization, the ones who engage with actual customers, the ones who often weren't really part of the strategy process, conclude that management is stuck in a bubble, roll their eyes, and just get on with what they were doing. All that new strategy ends up being good for is justifying some uneconomic projects, the ones labeled strategic because they lose money. Everybody knows that no real change in trajectory will happen because of them. Even if you are the CEO, it can feel at times as if the inertia caused by individual behaviors and social dynamics is rather hard to deal with, and getting in the way of doing the right thing for your business. One of our client CEOs in Australia recently reflected, "I am well aware of the fact that we should be moving faster in that direction, but I have to bring the team along." You might be in the enviable position of leading an agile startup or an amazing Amazon-scale institution that still operates like it did on day one. If so, congratulations. You may find some of the empirics in this book interesting because of what they show about what works and what doesn't in strategies, but you should really just keep doing what you're doing. If you are like the managers we more commonly come across, however, you will easily recognize the symptoms we are talking about and be keen to confront the social side of strategy. And even if you are Amazon-like, you might use some of the insights shared here to see a slip coming ahead of time. The villain is the social side of strategy. We all know that we go into the strategy process loaded with individual and institutional biases, and that group dynamics in the strategy room often distort results. But that's where the thinking about social dynamics usually ends. How often are we making an explicit effort to understand these factors and to properly deal with them? Don't we tend to shrug our shoulders and soldier on? Too often, we seem to pretend that the strategy process is just about solving an analytical problem, knowing deep down that the analysis is really the easy part. Frameworks and tools, the likes of which you find in your typical business book or consulting deck, can be useful in structuring your thinking and can help generate ideas. Unfortunately, they usually don't help us break through the real barriers to good strategy. The simple reason? The social side of strategy can overwhelm the intellectual side. Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Nowhere is that more evident than in the strategy room. How can that be? After all, that room is full of smart and experienced people who welcome an intellectual challenge. But strategy isn't the only thing that's at stake here. Jobs, even careers, are on the line too. You can lose your job or status if you overpromise or underdeliver on your performance goals. So not surprisingly, caution reigns, and a strategy process that is about job protection rarely produces the best outcomes for the company. The budget process intrudes too. You may be discussing a 5-year strategy, but everyone knows that what really matters is the first-year budget. Inevitably, other sorts of games are played. Most managers, for instance, will try to secure resources for the coming year while deferring accountability for the returns on these investments as far as possible into the future. Maybe even long enough that people will have forgotten about the original commitments, or that they themselves will have moved on to the next position. Even the most successful business leaders are human, after all. The strategy room is full of so many competing agendas and social games that you might have sometimes wondered why people spent so much time and effort on the analysis and presentation preparations in the first place. The outcome of all these dynamics is the hockey stick, confidently showing future success after the all-too-familiar dip on next year's budget. Truly, if ever there was one, the hockey stick is the icon of the strategy process. If we just mention the phrase, we get a knowing glance and a wry smile from the executives we've shared our research with. With this book, we want to break the hockey stick. We want to address the social side of strategy so the big moves that drive economic profit and shareholder value can actually happen. Where is the outside view? For more than 5 years now, the three of us have invested in understanding why things get bogged down so easily in the strategy process and on developing a new angle on how to deal with the issues. Having spent decades consulting with hundreds of companies across the globe and having seen countless strategic plans, we began this journey by drawing on our personal observations. But we also decided to take our own medicine. We have tried to push past the usual anecdotes and juxtapose experience with the reality of hard facts on corporate performance. We supplemented our observations with detailed research and analysis of several thousand of the world's largest companies. These are big sample empirics, not the traditional collection of a few dozen interview-based case studies. We found that in most strategy rooms, there simply aren't enough data, and certainly not all the right data. That may seem to be an odd statement given our complaints about all those 150-page documents and their endless appendices, but those documents tend to take too narrow a view of the world. They are based on an inside view, the data from your own industry, the perspective of your own company, and the experience of your own team and of the executives in the strategy room. The materials in strategy rooms today provide detail, but no reference data with predictive power. Interestingly, the more detailed the information you have, the more you lead yourself to believe that you know, and the more your confidence grows, the higher the risk of arriving at the wrong conclusions. When changing times demand a really big shift in strategy, this inside view turns out to be even more of a problem. It's an inside view of the wrong world, and you are caught blindsided. Rather than an ever more precise inside view, strategy needs an outside view, where data about the thousands of other experiences by other executives and their companies in other strategy rooms are brought into your own strategy room to shape the discussion. Why benchmark just your operational KPIs when you could have an equally compelling objective reference point for your strategy? Why not calibrate how good your strategy really is against a broad set of comparative data? The problem, you might say, is that every situation is unique, right? No other company has our brand, our resources, our set of competitors, our customers, our challenges, our opportunities. And companies aren't exactly sharing all their data with the world to make it easy for you to compare yourself against them anyway. Well, yes. That's why there never has been a comprehensive database of strategic success and failure. Until now. We looked at publicly available information on dozens of variables for thousands of companies and found a manageable number of levers, 10 in fact, that explain over 80% of updrift and downdrift in corporate performance. We'll share those data with you in this book to give you that outside view. We will show you a way to see how your strategy stacks up before you ever leave the strategy room and before you start to execute your strategy. If you don't think you've given yourself strong enough odds of success, you can fall back, regroup, and reformulate your strategy to improve your chances. All that before you start down the costly road that might just find another dead end. We will give you a new way of gaining confidence in bold strategies that change the direction of your business, because you will be able to now know the chances of your strategy succeeding, calibrated against a verifiable yardstick of corporate performance. In the sports world, golf announcers can tell the odds that a pro will make a putt of a certain length because the data on all the putts by all the pros have been compiled. Football stats buffs can tell you the odds that a team will win based on the score, the quarter, the number of first downs, and the name of the quarterback, because all that data have been aggregated across league games over many years. The same sort of data is now available about corporate strategy. Making big moves happen. To get ahead of ourselves a little bit, the data show in particular that many companies are simply not bold enough. Their strategies are not designed for big moves. All too often, the results are incremental improvements that have companies just playing along with the rest of their industries. We are sure you've seen it yourself. Even if there is a major business opportunity and someone comes in with a breakthrough idea, it tends to get whittled down. The idea feels too risky, too different from what other players are doing. Some people might feel left out. It seems safer to come up with a plan that just varies slightly from last year's, to spread resources across the whole business rather than bet heavily on the breakout of one single unit. We recently saw one CEO ask his team for aggressive growth plans. He got them back and liked many of them, only to have to cut back because there was no way to fund them all. In the end, he did not want to frustrate all but a few of his team by disproportionately allocating resources to the likely breakouts, and instead granted some resources to all the businesses. Needless to say, none of them were funded well enough to achieve a real breakthrough. Another CEO asked his team for bold moves and received an M&A idea for growing a new service business in the U.S. The idea passed a rigorous due diligence process, but then he got cold feet. Yet another CEO came up with a plan to leapfrog to 5G mobile communications technology that would have provided a temporary competitive advantage in Europe, but then felt the board was unlikely to approve that bold plan and self-censored the proposal to protect himself. He settled on a plan that was not much more than an extension of the past. Our research indicates that to make sustained progress relative to competing businesses, you need to, foremost, choose the right markets to compete in, but also to pull hard enough on at least some of the levers we've identified to clear well-quantified threshold. The good news is, these big moves do not come at the expense of increased risk. In fact, our data show that the biggest risks might lie in not moving at all. This might sound a bit fluffy for now, but as you go through the book, we will get you the hard data you need and the factual insights to support your decisions. The journey ahead of us. We intend to take you now on a journey through the strategy room that will eventually get you to a better chance of knowing the right big moves and to an understanding of the social side of strategy that will let you actually execute those moves. For now, we will leave you with the assertion that our insights dovetail. The data, the outside view, play a big role in giving you a chance to successfully address the problems caused by the social side of strategy and its drag towards inertia, towards small moves that feel safe. In many ways, our insights resemble the discoveries of behavioral economists, which trace all the way back to Herbert Simon in the 1950s, but which have really gathered steam over the past couple of decades, with both Daniel Kahneman and more recently Richard Thaler earning Nobel Prizes in economics. Traditionally, economists considered everyone to be acting rationally, which led to rigorous seeming curves that were easy to comprehend, but in the real world, rarely predicted actual behavior. It turned out that people don't view their lives as a series of utility curves. Behavioral economists shed light on how people think and behave. Like these behavioral economists, we have learned that purely rational approaches, the next 3x3 matrix, the latest best practice case studies, rarely help in achieving breakthroughs in strategy. But observations of what's really going on in the strategy rooms and in the boardrooms of corporations all over the globe give us hope that it is actually possible to generate an outside view that will improve the quality of strategy and consequently business performance. After a long series of spirited discussions with many of your peers and our partner colleagues around the world, we feel ready to shed new light on what's going on in the strategy room. Based on our empirical observations and insights, we will take the strategy discussion out of the realm of the theoretical and into the realm of actual behavior, then lay out our data so that you yourself can shape new, more fruitful conversations with your team. If we do this right, you will have a chance to raise your game in many ways so that you improve the quality of strategy proposals that are discussed in your strategy room, engage in a very different, more collaborative and learning-oriented strategy dialogue with your team, experience more authenticity, more rigor, and better challenges in your strategy room, make less biased, better strategy decisions calibrated against the empirics of an outside view, lead your team with more courage to make big moves, take calculated risks, and more vigorously commit to the execution of your strategies. To help you tame the social side of strategy, we'll start by exploring why it's so hard to manage. Then we'll lay out a new way of tracking progress based on comparisons against the whole universe of companies, not just against your prior performance or against your industry. We'll go into depth about how to think about the 10 key variables, which we refer to collectively as your endowment, your trends, and your moves, so you can figure your odds of success and improve them while there's still time. Finally, at the end of the book, we will share with you very practical advice, 8 shifts designed to help you change the dynamics in your strategy room. For instance, we will explain how to turn the strategy process from a staccato event into a continually evolving conversation. We'll explain how to get away from spreading resources thinly and actually reallocating resources to potentially big winners. How to change your focus from setting budget targets and toward generating big moves. How to end sandbagging, and more. These shifts can make your strategy process far more effective and, we hope, a lot more energizing too. What will you need to do? Just 2 things. Get ready to embrace the social side of strategy and be prepared to throw open the windows of your strategy room to allow for a data-driven outside view to enter the discussion. If you are ready to do so, you will experience your own business and your own leadership team in a new way. You will develop better strategies, and you will have a better chance of executing them well. In short, you will have a better shot at beating the odds. Chapter 1. Games in the Strategy Room and Why People Play Them. Strategy is precisely the wrong problem for human brains and the right problem for playing games, especially when the inside view goes unchecked. Many corporate strategy planning processes begin with a memo like the one following. You've probably seen them before, or written some yourself. They typically lead you and your colleagues to spend months doing lots of work employing sophisticated tools, getting lots of inputs, and using lots of data. The memo itself is pretty straightforward. 2. Leadership Team, CC Corporate Staff, Ray Strategy Process 2018. Dear Leadership Team, with this note, we kick off the strategy cycle of 2018, building on the great work in 2017. We will run the process in 3 steps. 1. Market analysis due March. 2. Key issues due May. 3. Full 5-year plan due June. In August, we will discuss the fully integrated plan with the board, from which we will launch the 2019 annual operating plan. We have limited the template to about 50 pages, and would hope you have a 10-page executive summary in each session so we can focus the conversation on the important topics. Very much looking forward to our discussions. Susan Miller, Chief Executive Officer. Templates for our discussions: market analysis, key issues, full 5-year plan. After the memo goes out, and after the months of work it kicks off, you generally come up with a solid understanding of what's happening in the marketplace and of the options you have for responding. The CEO leads a series of discussions and formulates a strategy which the board approves. Then you do the budget, and nothing much happens. The results are rarely a serious problem. It's not often that you end up having existential issues like those at Kodak, Blockbuster, or Nokia. Those high-profile cases get so much attention partly because they're rare. But even when a strategy succeeds, the wins too often remain small. The strategy rarely moves the needle very far in the right direction, at least for any length of time. It's not so much that the rocket veers off course in midair. It is more often a failure to launch with enough energy to shoot for the moon. You've spent all that time and effort and only climbed how far over the last year? The social side of strategy, in action. The inside view creates a veritable petri dish that can grow all sorts of dysfunctions once that strategy memo goes out, producing the sort of scenario that we've all seen. On Saturday before the strategy discussion, the CEO receives that 150-page document plus appendices as a pre-read. Sigh. The CEO knows that the discussion that's about to start is not so much about the substance. Instead, the process is a sort of management ballet that is choreographed to get a yes to the proposed strategy and an approval of the resources requested. On Monday morning, a presenter starts by giving a market outlook and competitive overview. Someone asks a question about page 5. We reckon that a presenter has a reasonable chance of making it to page 5 before being interrupted, at which point the serious games around the social side of strategy start. The response might be, "We will cover that on page 42, knowing, of course, that it's extremely unlikely they'll ever get to page 42 before the end of the meeting, if page 42 even exists. Perhaps the answer is, "We have considered that, and there is an extensive appendix on exactly that question." Or, "Good question, let's take that offline." We've all seen these little social tricks, right? Presenters in strategy meetings often seem to not seek a conversation at all. Instead, they appear to deflect as many questions as they can, saying they are trying to get through the materials. They want to move to the last page of the presentation as smoothly as possible, and then get that all-important yes to the plan, that yes to the resource request, that yes to have a shot at the next promotion. A successful meeting is deemed to be one with little friction and maximum good feelings. Fast forward a bit in the strategy presentation to the discussion of market share performance, or the analysis of strengths and weaknesses. How likely is it for the plan to show low or declining market share? How often does a SWOT analysis come out on the weak side? Those analyses look strong, even though we all know for a fact that not every company can win. If one company gains share and gathers strength, others must lose. How often does the presenter arrive at the conclusion that further investments in their own business are not warranted, that the company should consider reallocating resources to other businesses, cutting back, or even exiting? That just never happens. In strategy presentations, it seems that everyone is a winner, all the time. CEOs are, of course, no dummies. They have seen these games played before, and many would readily admit that they had to play some of these themselves along the way. Even CEOs would acknowledge giving their plans a risk haircut before presenting them to the board. Even then, the presenter can still manipulate the data by relying on the inside view. For one, somebody presenting about their business unit has a distinct knowledge advantage over everyone else in the room. Looking at past performance, for instance, should be straightforward, based on 20/20 hindsight, but it's not. So often, there are distortions that are too subtle to catch while conversing in the strategy room. Market share can be defined favorably by excluding geographies or segments where the presenter's business unit is weak. Poor performance can be attributed to one-off items such as the weather, restructuring efforts, new market entrants, or a regulatory change. Markets may be summarized in a way that removes all insight. People end up talking to each other about the average temperature of the patients in a hospital. The dreaded hockey stick. The inside games soon get us to the hockey stick, the icon of the social side of strategy shown in Exhibit 1. Hockey sticks are everywhere. You might even say that business plan is the technical term for a hockey stick. We have all seen the graphs that show revenue and profit heading straight for the sky a few years out. All that's needed is a bit of an investment for the first year or two, a bit of tolerance for some losses. Then you can start booking huge numbers. It's going to be a great business if we can just get some additional resources today, and you stick with us through a couple of lean years, we'll produce a rocket headed toward the stars. As many of us have seen from personal experience, these hockey sticks rarely work out. But they are a great way of bargaining for resources for that all-important first-year operating budget. People make ambitious claims, arguing that they need a serious amount of resources, all in the full knowledge that they will get negotiated down to half of that. As one CEO told us, the strategy process is a ritual dance before you get to what really matters, the annual operating plan. Executives know that failure to have a hockey stick projection pan out generally brings fewer repercussions than not presenting it in the first place. The projections delay the day of reckoning. Who knows, maybe the plan will work perfectly. Maybe the executive will get lucky and market conditions will fall just right. Maybe the CEO will forget the grand promise. Or maybe a new CEO will be in place by then. Maybe the executive presenting the hockey stick will have moved on. In any case, a hockey stick helps win the argument today, and that's what strategy processes boil down to. The priority is getting to a yes. There is one more reason why you can't not present a hockey stick as a manager. Everyone else does it. If you did not do it, even though you know the projection is off reality, you would send a signal that you lack confidence in your business. Presenting hockey sticks is a ritual for all to partake in. So, hockey sticks it is. Some executives find ways to cut through the gamesmanship. When Jack Welch was CEO of General Electric, for instance, he declared that all his businesses needed to be number 1 or number 2 in their markets. But he found over time that business leaders redefined their markets so they could claim to be number 1 or number 2. He then demanded that everyone come up with a market definition in which they had less than 10% market share, thereby creating a breakthrough in the denominator game. Far more typically, though, the social side of strategy turns the strategy conversation into some form of a beauty contest in which participants want to look good, and the data they present are carefully selected to underscore the right impression. In a speech at the annual Global Partner Meeting of McKinsey, the then CEO of a major Las Vegas casino operator said, "Whenever I arrive at one of our properties and meet the general manager, he would inevitably tell me that everything is going great, regardless of their actual performance. They would always deliver an impressive speech on why their business was going well, or if it lost money, why it was just about to get better, a whole lot better." Sighs. I just wish I met once, just once, a guy who would walk up to me and say, "Man, things are not well down here, and to tell you the truth, I can't tell which way is up. I really have no idea why things are heading south. But we are on it, rolling up our sleeves to turn this sucker around." Can we handle the truth? Why aren't people as open as they wish they were? Why are they politically correct? Remember the movie Tootsie and a classic interaction between Michael, Dustin Hoffman, and Julie, Jessica Lange? Michael has fallen for Julie, but has no idea how to approach her. Dressed in drag as Tootsie, and now a confidant for Julie, he hears her lament about how men are always hitting on her and saying she'd love a man who could just be honest. Thinking he's cracked the code, Michael, no longer in drag, says to Julie exactly what she said she hoped to hear from a man. She slaps him, hard. Then she walks away. We may think we want the truth, but if we are honest, we might not always want it. Jack Nicholson says, as Colonel Jessup in A Few Good Men, "You want the truth? You can handle the truth." We've all learned along the way that bluntness is risky, so we can't even imagine an executive who would tell the CEO that their business unit was in trouble and that they had no idea why. That executive would probably have a lot more to fear than a slap on the wrist. People's egos, their careers, their bonuses, their status in the organization, the resources they get to fund the growth of their business, all depend to a large extent on how convincingly they present their strategies and the prospects of their business. Think about how far people go in creating successful profiles on dating websites. Neither the pictures nor the facts have much resemblance to reality, but the goal is to get that first reply and avoid the abyss of being swiped away. We've all seen these games in business, too. Some managers project vision and competence at the negotiating table, claiming more resources than are warranted. Others sandbag to avoid risky moves and make triple sure they overachieve on their targets. When everyone else is playing games, why would you stand out as the sole voice of realism? Playing the inside game. Even though boards and investors are always demanding progress, and we all certainly expect that of ourselves, just holding position is often already an accomplishment. Competition is tough. Think about it. While you're locked up in your own strategy room, the very same discussions are happening across town in your competitor's strategy room as well. Although we all seem to just focus on the issues in front of us, we are also making the treadmill run a little faster for everyone. Silicon Valley pioneer Bill Joy said, "No matter who you are, most of the smart people work for someone else." It's true, and competitors will always work diligently to counteract your strategy, or will pursue just about the same opportunities that you see. But if you're like the vast majority of those in the strategy rooms around the world, you aren't very focused on what's happening in those other strategy rooms or on the smart ideas of your competitors. You're seeing an inside view and are playing more of an inside game. The inside view often prevails in strategy rooms because they are tightly sealed. What comes into the room is basically what the participants bring in with them. That is generally a great deal of relevant experience carried in the brains and memories of a few executives. A lot of data and information comes into the room too, but it is typically focused on your own company, a handful of key competitors, and your own industry. A lot of information stays outside the room. The air gets stuffy and recycled. People are reading their own mail. Strategies can also be constrained because they are being developed bottom up, as each business unit projects how it will perform over the coming years. Those plans, which are rolled up into the company-wide strategy, are rarely calibrated against outside data to see how similar growth plans historically fared at similar businesses in similar situations. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman explained in his brilliant book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, how the realities of the outside world can disappear and be replaced by what he labeled the inside view. The inside view leads people to extrapolate from their own experiences and data, even when they are attempting something they've never done before. Kahneman says even he has fallen victim to the bias while designing a new syllabus and textbooks for the Ministry of Education in Israel. The team, relying on their experiences in other endeavors, initially projected that they would finish in 1.5 to 2.5 years. When Kahneman looked at how similar teams had performed on similar projects, he learned that 40% of similar teams never finished, and that those that did needed 7 to 10 years. The good news is that his team did finish, but it needed 8 years, more than 3 times as long as they predicted. The sheer length of the strategy process can also galvanize the inside view. Studies of cognitive biases show that experts become more confident as they gather more data, even though the additional data might not make the expert's projections any more accurate. Overconfidence is self-reinforcing too. It leads people to ignore contradictory information, which makes them more confident, which makes them more likely to ignore contradictory information. As weeks and months go by, and the spreadsheets get larger and more detailed, an unwarranted sense of confidence can take hold. It turns out that the more we know, the more dangerous we are. The inside view reigns. We convince ourselves that we have a winning plan this year, even though we continue doing pretty much what we've always done. Look at how precise economic projections are, and how wrong. In the U.S., the government produces annually 45,000 pieces of economic information, and the private sector generates 4 million more, leading to forecasts that may run to multiple decimal points. The forecasts are reassuring. The prognosticators are smart folks. Yet most economists didn't predict the 3 most recent recessions in the U.S. in 1990, 2001, and 2007, and didn't even see the recessions happening after they'd started. The initial estimate for growth in the U.S. economy in the 4th quarter of 2008 was negative 3.8%. The actual drop turned out to be negative 9%. Nobody has a clue. It's hugely difficult to forecast the business cycle, said Jan Hatzius, chief economist at Goldman Sachs. Yet we still act as though we can predict to a decimal point or two. Send in the guru. Yes, senior teams sometimes try to complement their inside views by exploring the outside world. One favorite is bringing in a guru. Those discussions tend to be quite interesting and provoke conversation. Surveys at our own global strategy conferences show that people love gurus. We invite them so people can find a compelling excuse to come. But how often do their presentations actually influence strategy? You may gain insight into some of the relevant trends, but how are you to act on them? Observing the writing on the wall is certainly easier than acting on it. Frequently, we are asked to provide information on other industries that faced challenges comparable to the situation at hand. But more often than not, the discussion then ends with the self-reassuring affirmation that our industry is different, or we've been in this industry for 100 years. Now this guy comes along and is trying to tell us to do what? We've had such comments thrown at us regularly, especially before growing a bit of gray hair. The reason? Well, people are often afraid that an analogy or benchmark might suggest that a higher level of performance could be achieved. That means tougher goals, and that might mean lower bonuses. It is not that people do not want to learn. They often like to see the translation of the analogy and performance potential in private meetings. They just do not want to have the discussion in the bigger meeting, not in the strategy room, and certainly not in the boardroom. The difficulties with today's strategy processes are not news to you? Welcome to the club. More than 70% of executives we surveyed say they don't like their strategy process, and 70% of board members don't trust the results. The wrong problem for human brains. Oftentimes, we think that if we can identify a problem, then we can overcome it. We're smart people, and our brains and wills are powerful instruments. But there are two reasons that simply knowing about the social problems isn't enough. The first reason is that strategy is done by humans. The second reason is that strategy is done by humans working together. Let's start with the done by humans problem. While strategy seems as though it should be a purely intellectual exercise, a sort of corporate game of chess, perhaps even played in 3 dimensions by its best practitioners, strategy problems are exactly the low-frequency, high-uncertainty problems for which the human brain is least adapted. People are prone to many well-documented unconscious cognitive biases: overconfidence, anchoring, loss aversion, confirmation bias, attribution error, etc. These biases exist to help us filter information for decision-making. Think about one of our ancestors wandering across the plains of Africa. On the occasion of that chap coming across a lion, the chances of him being part of our gene pool today are relatively low if he started to think about the clouds, the beauty of the landscape, or the prospects of finding a meal for the day. They all are possibly interesting or even important topics, but not species extending in the face of a lion. With fear-induced myopia, our ancestor focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was getting away when seeing a lion. So our brain came with a lot of shortcuts, heuristics in technical terms, that lurk in the deeper parts of the subconscious mind. They can sure help with day-to-day decision-making in our modern lives. We all seem pretty good at that, maybe even extremely good. Just think of how good we are at driving a car. Even the dopiest person seems to get by okay on the road. No, the issue is not the daily decisions, where we get countless opportunities to practice and where mistakes yield immediately and possibly painful feedback. Here, our brains have evolved to run on sort of a limbic autopilot, like that of the ancestor avoiding the lion. These unintentional mental shortcuts can distort the outcomes, though, when we are forced to make big, consequential decisions infrequently and under high uncertainty. And these are exactly the ones we confront in the strategy room. Even the most seasoned executives have only limited experience and pattern recognition in these situations. Decisions are taken under uncertainty, and results may not show up for years. In the meantime, any number of human factors, market factors, lag factors, and noise can intrude and overwhelm any strategist's ability to predict an outcome. What actually happens may have little to do with the quality of the strategy. Trying to improve your strategic decision-making is like trying to improve your golf game by practicing blindfolded and not finding out if your ball went into the hole for 3 years. The biased mind. Consider the decision on whether to donate your organs in the event of an untimely death. It seems a very important one that would typically involve considerable contemplation. But in reality, it turns out that something as minor as the design of the driver's license application form, whether it is an opt-in or an opt-out, makes all the difference. In Denmark, where the program is opt-in, 4% of the population donate organs, while neighboring Sweden, where donation is opt-out, reports 86% participation. Opt-in Netherlands is at merely 28%, even after lots of marketing spend, while its opt-out neighbor Belgium reports 98% participation. Opt-in Germany is at 12%, while opt-out neighbors France, Austria, Hungary, and Poland are all north of 99%. The simple explanation is that when confronted with complex decisions, such as signing up for an organ donation program, our minds tend to stall, and we decide nothing. We tend to go with the form without checking the box, no matter whether it's opt-in or opt-out. The subconscious brain is more powerful than we think. Here are some of our all-time favorite biases that we see in strategy rooms. Halo effect. Our 6% profit growth last year reflected our decision to continue investing in digital, and in the face of tough trading conditions, we remained ruthless on costs. A team giving itself a pat on the back, even though the whole market also grew profits by 6%. Anchoring. We forecast 8% growth next year, plus or minus 1 percentage point, depending on the demand environment. We will achieve this by pushing even harder on our current projects. So 8% is the starting point of the negotiation, whether or not it should be. Confirmation bias. We've put lots of work into analyzing the reasons why this will work, but no work into the reasons why it won't. We've also heard that our top competitor is exploring this opportunity, so it must be a good idea. Good luck with trying to stop the momentum for that project. Champion bias. We have a great team behind us. We've succeeded on projects like this before. You should have the confidence in us to do it again. Deflecting attention from the merits of the project alone. Loss aversion. We don't want to put our baseline at risk by chasing blue sky ideas. We really appreciate the hard work that's gone into alternative strategies and new business lines, but ultimately, we think the risks outweigh the benefits, even though the existing baseline might be under threat. When you bring together a bunch of people with shared experiences and shared goals, they typically wind up telling themselves stories, generally favorable ones, and we are in the perfect den for these biases to flourish. A study found, for instance, that 80% of executives believed that their product stood out against the competition, and that 8% of customers agreed. This sort of confirmation bias is why people read publications with the same political bent that they have. People may try to challenge themselves, but they really want to nod their heads as their beliefs are confirmed. Perceptions can also matter more than reality. Respect for past achievements, for instance, can play a big role. A legendary engineer promoted to lead the switching business of a European producer of telecom gear had literally all his resource requests for the old core business approved at will, until the company had completely missed the transition to router-based networks and became an acquisition target. Strategy processes are also prone to survivor bias. There is no noise coming from the graveyard of silent failures because we only see what happened, not what didn't happen. We read all the case studies about great companies that succeeded, with explanations rationalized after the fact for why they did so. There is lots of talk about Warren Buffett, but we hear nothing about the thousands of investors who decided in the same year as Buffett to start buying into businesses but failed. We can precisely measure the behavior of the customers we have, but what about the silent voices of the customers we don't have? Our experiences are more shaped by learning from survivors, and in a way, we all are survivors. Our strategy rooms are fraught with biases related to not having failed big time. Strategy processes really are in the running for the world's biggest zoo of frolicking biases and social distortions. Now, add social dynamics to the mix. As hard as it might be to overcome those individual biases, they are only part of the reason why you can't just understand the social problems of strategy and assume that you'll then be able to overcome them. Yes, as soon as you introduce people into strategy, you get biases. Then when you introduce other people, that is, when the approver is different from the doer, you get agency problems. Don't get us wrong, we have a lot of respect for the people involved in the strategy process. They often are the smartest, most experienced leaders in their businesses. We are not suggesting people are either ill-intended, incapable, or both. Quite the opposite, actually. People bring a lot of experience, ideas, and energy to their missions. But with them come biases, too. Agency problems are fueled by incongruences between management and other stakeholders. Here are just a few of the more prominent ways that managers may act in their own interest, and not purely in that of the enterprise and its stakeholders. Sandbagging. I'm not going to put my neck on the line. I'm only going to agree to a plan that I know for sure I can deliver. My reputation is on the line, and I can't risk being the one division that misses budget. The reality is that individuals will often have a different attitude toward risk than their overall enterprise does. The short game. Someone else will be running this division in 3 years anyway. I just need to milk performance for the next couple of years, get a good bonus, and the next promotion, or maybe get poached by our competitor. The motivations of the executive are not automatically aligned to those of the owners. My way or your problem. I know this business and this industry better than the CEO and better than the board. They'll just have to believe what I tell them. If I say it's too hard, it's too hard. If I don't get the resources I ask for, then there's my excuse for not delivering. The line executive has inside knowledge, and often the CEO and the board have little choice but to accept their version of the truth. I am my numbers. I get judged by my numbers, not by how I spend my time. I'm just going to work hard enough to hit my targets, but not a lot more. One's supervisor can't directly observe the quality of effort, and results can be noisy signals. Were those poor results a noble failure? Were those great results dumb luck? You have people who you'd hope are all pulling in the same direction. But in reality, they have very different motivations and certainly asymmetric information. While CEOs will try to optimize for the overall success of their companies, those who report to them will for sure care a lot more about their individual business units and about those people who work for them. How can they not? We all know that the people whose business thrives will be the ones who get rewarded. People, for the most part, are not bad. They're just perfectly evolved to play the game. In fact, much of a business leader's stature might reflect just how good he or she is at playing it. Based on attribution bias, you are your numbers, so they'd better be good, no matter how you get there. Let's not forget incentives either. There are too many to recount all of them here, and they go way beyond financial remuneration. Presenting in front of your superiors or your peers is a matter of pride. Your track record is a matter of ego. Your team wants protection. Charles Munger and Warren Buffett used to say, 95% of behavior is driven by personal or collective incentives, only to later correct themselves. The 95% was wrong. It is more like 99%. Strategy involves a complex set of motivations in a complex game. Far from having a single goal that everyone can focus on, executives are negotiating next year's budget, competing for resources, delegating responsibilities to others, maintaining and escalating prior commitments, impressing the board, inspiring confidence among a broader set of stakeholders, all at the same time. They know that they have to craft a strategy that claims to generate 15% increase to get the 10% they really want, and they know that the main act is the budget. The strategy discussion is just the opening salvo. Perhaps the most widely read piece of research that McKinsey has published in the past decade showed that companies that rapidly reallocate capital to new growth businesses outperform those that take a steady state approach. Yet the social side of strategy is such that companies still tend to take what is known as a peanut butter approach, spreading a thin layer of resources smoothly across the whole enterprise, even though it's clear that opportunities are far greater in some areas than in others. With everyone competing so hard for resources, it's tough to make decisions about winners and losers. Picking winners may sometimes be easier, but it's definitely hard to starve a business with less potential, especially if the leader has been around a long time or the business is a big part of the company's history. No matter the precise motivation, executives will use every bit of social power they have to improve the chances of their business succeeding. We've seen people do all sorts of things. We've even seen one executive, the president of one of the largest consumer electronics companies in the world, be denied the resources he felt he needed, and then rally loyal members of the board to get the CEO fired. That story, by the way, did not end well for the insurgent, who was soon ushered out the door, nor for the company. But the point is, even if we don't like to acknowledge it, we are social creatures and covet status in the tribe. This was an excellent trait from an evolutionary perspective when it was important to be the big gorilla in the jungle, but can be an obstacle when developing good strategies. When the inside view remains unchecked. The best breeding conditions for creating a flawed strategy are when the inside view remains unchallenged, creating a false sense of certainty about what will happen. Many, in fact very many people, do strategy as if they were the only horse in the race, almost ignoring that competitors are making strategies too. People try to throw good money after bad, so past decisions don't reveal themselves to be mistakes. Those in the strategy room are confident because they have accounted for all the risk they can see, not realizing that the perils are in the risks they can't see. So often, good performance is attributed to superior management, and bad performance is blamed on market conditions. Kodak's failure to adapt to digital photography has become a classic example of strategic failure. The story has been told enough, so we will resist the temptation to recount it entirely, but let's highlight the role of the inside view. We have personally experienced the early advantage Kodak had in digital photography after one of its researchers in the mid-1970s invented the sensor that it used in digital cameras, and after the company was early to market with a consumer camera in the late 1990s. Yes, the camera looked like a brick, and the pictures were a bit grainy by today's standards, but they were good enough for one of the authors of this book to take as the only camera on his honeymoon trip to Australia. See the original 1997 picture. Not bad, eh? Kodak clearly was in the game early on, but people who were involved in the strategy process at Kodak back then say that the real problem was that management never got past their inside view. Film, chemicals, and paper had been around for so long that management could simply not imagine a world in which people didn't light up at the prospect of collecting their prints in little yellow boxes. Even more daunting was the fact that the traditional film business had been generating gross margins of more than 60% for a long time. It was hard to cannibalize a business that had sustained those performance levels for decades, especially because the margins in any consumer electronics business were expected to be much lower. The assumption that the traditional film business would always be around simply never got sufficiently challenged in the strategy room, even though ample evidence to the contrary was available, including at Kodak, which had done a major study in the early 1980s. Kodak management never seriously debated whether digital might turn out to be a superior technology. They spent $500 million developing a camera, the Advantix, that was fully digital, but still used film and generated prints. The digital capabilities just let you scroll through images to decide which ones you wanted to print. The camera bombed. Customers simply didn't love prints as much as Kodak strategists thought they did. By now, business magazines and literature have assembled a rather impressive list of similar cases where once great companies ran into difficulties when trends changed the game, or their business models ran out of steam. Circuit City, Sears, Grundig, and Wang, just to name a few. So today's strategists are more likely to try to find an outside perspective and to bring it into the strategy room, but the inside game still makes it hard to act. For most businesses, the best predictor of next year's budget is still this year's budget, plus or minus a few percent, of course. Strategy processes often generate a high-level commitment to making a change, but too often, as with a failing dieter or cigarette quitter, the processes don't surface and deal with other prior commitments that immunize companies against change. As one CEO told us, if you want a big idea done, you have to pursue it to the last detail. Just because the group said yes doesn't mean it's going to happen. Bringing about change in the corporations of today reminds us of an attempt to move an octopus, when one leg of the octopus is totally committed to going to the next rock, but the other 7 remain completely committed to holding on to the rock they're already grasping. Just changing mindsets won't be enough, though. The social side of strategy won't give up the fight that easily. A golf instructor won't help much by telling you, don't slice. He must give you something positive that you can actually do to solve the problem. Hence, we'll now lay out the empirical research that will provide you with an outside view. We'll begin by giving you a new way to map out your competitive situation, then show you where you need to go. It's going to be a bit of a journey, so stick with us. Chapter 2. Opening the windows of your strategy room. The power curve built from the economic profits of thousands of companies gives a fresh outside view of the universe of strategy as it really is. Before Christopher Columbus sailed for the New World in 1492, maps of the world were very detailed and very wrong. A typical one looked like the Fra Mauro map. Mapmakers who had experience with Europe drew that continent reasonably accurately. Here in the middle right of the chart, you have to turn it upside down because back then south was at the top. That's Spain, a fraction inside the black dot at the middle on the right, followed by the southern tips of Italy and then Greece as your eyes move left across the Mediterranean. But the mapmakers back then also drew Africa and Asia just as confidently, despite little knowledge of those unexplored coastlines. Not surprisingly, they missed the Western Hemisphere entirely. The map didn't make any distinction between the up-close familiar Mediterranean territories and the myths crowding the farther edges of the map. The map ended up being really full, no space for curiosity left in there. Thus, when Columbus sailed west from Spain, he thought he was some 4,000 miles away from Japan, when he was actually 12,500 miles away, with an unknown continent in between. After Columbus hit that new continent, at what we now call the West Indies, mapmakers realized just how much they didn't know and began limiting themselves. They drew only what they knew and left blank spaces for the explorers to fill in. Maps began to look like the Diogo Ribeiro map from 1529. This had the outline of the east coast of the new continents there in the middle, but left the rest for later, and what's more, was the right way up. In just a generation, the map of the world had been irrevocably transformed, a true paradigm shift. The continents aren't, of course, named North Columbus and South Columbus. They're called North and South America, named after an Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, who played the smallest role in the early voyages. He won the honor because while Columbus and many others never gave up the certainty of those old maps, Vespucci speculated in two texts that the islands that Columbus found were actually part of a new continent. A mapmaker accepted that argument in 1507 and, mistakenly thinking that Vespucci had discovered the continent, named it America in his honor. When that map became popular, others adopted the name and he was immortalized, all because Vespucci was willing to challenge assumptions. Yuval Noah Harari argues in *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind* that the blank spaces on the new maps didn't just provide the right template for the age of exploration, they also ushered in the scientific revolution. He believes that the doubts manifested in these modern maps guided an entire class of scientists to leave blank spaces for others to fill in, as knowledge increased in many scientific fields. The embracing of ignorance had to come before the embracing of knowledge. Upon reflection, we thought that the current state of strategy at times reminds us a bit more of those early maps. Good insights from a close-up view, and surrounded by a detailed and compelling narrative with lots of analysis. It might feel as if the strategy room is jammed so full with slides and facts from the inside view that there is little leeway for curiosity and wonder about what the external view would say. There is simply not enough room left for uncertainty and exploration. By no means do we want to imply that we discovered a new continent, but we thought it might be helpful to start with conceding that the map for navigating corporate performance is not perfectly understood yet. With that, we set out to add some information to the map by bringing in an outside view to help you chart a new course for your business toward better performance. Now we commence our own tour of discovery. The right yardstick. Let's start creating the new map by setting a clear yardstick for good strategy, a proper compass to guide the way. Some would look at gains in share price, but that struck us as too mercurial, too dependent on the starting and ending dates of the measurement, and maybe also a bit too influenced by factors outside the control of management. Others would look at growth in revenue, yet others at earnings or cash flow. So, could one metric be the yardstick for business performance? Probably not. But economic profit comes pretty close, we think. At its heart, business strategy is all about beating the market, or in other words, defying the power of perfect markets to push economic surplus back to zero. Economic profit, the total profit after the cost of capital is subtracted, measures the success of that defiance by showing what is left on the table after the forces of competition have played out. Of course, businesses also pursue other objectives, such as delivering inventions, securing employment, or making social contributions and building communities. But if good strategy succeeds in taming market forces, residual economic profit will grow, making it also easier to accomplish the other objectives. Oddly, you won't find economic profit in any audited financial statements, and our surveys find it is rarely used in the world of strategy. Some executives even asked us, "Didn't we just throw EVA out the window?" Well, we're bringing it back. We believe it is a good metric, as it shows both by how much a company has beaten the market and the scale of that success. Not only does economic profit measure margin and scale, it also incorporates margin development, sales growth, and cash flow. If we have to choose one variable to measure an enterprise, or at least its purely economic contribution, economic profit could be it. Because we do lots of presentations on this work, we often get asked, but what about returns to shareholders, or NPV? Growth in economic profit drives shareholder returns, but is much less noisy and more under control of management. We found that over a period of 10 years, the top quintile of companies based on growth in economic profit delivered the strongest total shareholder returns, plus 17% per year, while the bottom quintile delivered the weakest, plus 7% per year. Economic profit captures the two parameters we know are driving share price performance over time: return on invested capital, ROIC, and growth. Besides, there are many commercial enterprises that are not listed on public markets, so economic profit is a more universally applicable measure. Let's get to know this yardstick a bit better. Exhibit 2. From 2010 to 2014, the average company in our database of the world's largest companies reported $920 million in annual operating profit. To make this profit, they used about $9.3 billion of invested capital, including the goodwill spent on past acquisitions. Dividing one by the other gives a return on invested capital of 9.9%. But investors and lenders in the average company required a return of 8% to compensate for use of their funds, measured by weighted average cost of capital. So the first $740 million of profit just made them whole. That left $180 million in economic profit. The spread over the average company's cost of capital multiplied by the scale of its business. Your business lives on a power curve. Once you plot all the economic profits in an ordered line, you find they demonstrate a power law. The tails of the curve rise and fall at exponential rates, with long flatlands in the middle. You get this chart pictured in Exhibit 3 called the power curve. To produce this chart depicting the power curve, we took financial performance data for 2,393 of the largest non-financial firms by revenue over the period 2010 to 2014 and estimated each company's average economic profit. The power curve shows each individual company's average economic profit over those 5 years, ranked from the lowest to the highest. Then we separated the power curve into 3 regions. The bottom of the curve, represented by the bottom quintile of companies, the middle of the curve, represented by the second, third, and fourth quintiles, and the top of the curve, represented by the top quintile of economic profit. There's a big gap from the middle to the top. The average economic profit on the top is 30 times greater. So if you're not at the high end already, the aspiration of joining the top-tier players should probably be on your mind. There are many instances of power laws in large data sets from economics, demography, and nature. The distribution of earthquake magnitudes follows such power laws, and so does the distribution of income for pro footballers, or book sales for that matter. Another example is Zipf's law, which notes that the most frequent word in English, the, occurs approximately twice as often as the second most frequent, of, 3 times as often as the third most, and so on. Remarkably, this example of a power law holds for any language. While we expected a broad distribution of results for economic profit, the steepness of the tails surprised us, as did how flat the broad middle was. Going back to our maps analogy, we thought we were headed for Japan and hit the West Indies instead. And the tails are even steeper if we include the true outliers of economic profit. Companies like Apple live on Mars, 2 floors up from the profit curve of ordinary companies. They might inspire mere mortal business leaders, but practically they don't fit on the scale of the chart, although they are included in our data set. Among other things, we realized that the extremes of the results render an average all but meaningless. If Jeff Bezos walks into an ordinary bar, the average wealth of the other people in the room would soar to more than $100 million, even though all the other customers' wallets remain just as slim as before. The average footballer's salary doesn't mean much, given the huge spread of figures. This is what life is like on a power curve. What we see on the map. Back in the strategy room, the power curve is not the map actually in use. Our inside view gives us a detailed look at how we compare with last year, with our immediate competitors, and with our expectations for the next year. But when we zoom way out and look at the landscape of profitability, at all major companies in all industries and geographies, we get an important new perspective. We see that the vast majority of profits are at one end of the curve and improve exponentially as you get closer to that end. So good strategy shouldn't focus narrowly on last year or on next year or on competitors. The goal of strategy needs to be to move to the right on the power curve. For most businesses, All those in the middle 3 quintiles, the practical challenge is how to escape the broad, flat middle of the curve and move up into the region on the right, where most profits accrue. We aren't saying there isn't any value in doing better than last year, of course there is. Nor are we saying that every company can make it to the top of the power curve. Garrison Keillor had his fictional Lake Woebegone, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. Just as there is no Lake Woebegone in Minnesota, there is no performance panacea that can enable exceptional performance for all. But zooming way out and looking at the whole landscape of economic profit gives you a very different perspective relative to what you see when you just focus on last year and next year. It gives you a map to explore when charting your strategy. When we show the power curve chart to CEOs, it always leads to a good conversation driven by curiosity about where they rank. Mostly, the initial reaction is that this is common sense, but not commonly applied. It is not deeply appreciated just how long and flat the middle is, nor how very high the mountains are. There are several important insights we gain from the power curve. Market forces are pretty efficient. Textbook theory says that economic profits should tend towards zero over time because they get competed away. We're happy to report that in most industries, profits are possible because real markets aren't perfect. The average company in our sample companies generates returns that exceed the cost of capital by almost 2 percentage points. But the market is chipping away at individual companies' profits all the time. That brutal competition is why it's so hard just to stay in place, and why hockey stick plans so seldom turn into reality. How many times have you seen that $100 million improvement program fail to drop money to the bottom line because all it did was keep your relative cost in line with your competitor? Rather than beating the market, the program was just part of playing along. You were keeping up with the Joneses. For companies in the middle of the power curve, the market is taking a heavy toll. In that flat part of the curve, all the hard work that people in the companies are doing often amounts to not much more than paying the rent. Companies in those 3 quintiles delivered economic profits averaging just $47 million a year. The discussion about the flatness of the curve in the middle simply isn't taking place in the strategy room now. The curve is extremely steep at the bookends. Companies in the top quintile capture nearly 90% of the economic profit created, averaging $1.4 billion annually. This is a hall of fame for business, with the top 40 companies including household names such as Apple, Microsoft, China Mobile, Samsung Electronics, Exxon, Johnson & Johnson, Oracle, Vodafone, Intel, Cisco, Nestle, Merck, Walmart, Coca-Cola, Audi, Unilever, and Siemens. The full list of top 40 companies earned $283 billion combined annual economic profit, more than half of the combined value for all 2,393 companies in the database, $417 billion. Overall, the companies in the top quintile average some 30 times as much economic profit as those in the middle 3 quintiles, while the bottom 20% make for deep economic losses. That unevenness exists within the top quintile, too. The top 2% together earn about as much as the next 8% combined. In smartphones, the top 2 companies, Apple and Samsung at the time, earned virtually all the economic profit. Yes, all the other mobile phone makers in aggregate destroyed value during that period. Apple earned more reselling memory in its iPhones and iPads than the entire memory industry making those very chips managed to capture. At the other end of the curve, the undersea canyon of negative economic profit is deep, though fortunately not quite as deep as the mountain is high. The curve is getting steeper over time. Back in 2000 to 2004, companies in the top quintile earned a collective $186 billion in economic profit. Fast forward a decade to 2010 to 14, and the top quintile captured $684 billion in economic profit. The bottom quintile generated a collective loss of $61 billion in 2000 to 04. A decade later, the bottom quintile was losing $321 billion. Not surprisingly, investors seek companies that offer market-beating returns. As they do, more capital flows to the top. Managers may be able to fool their bosses, but they can't fool investors. Capital doesn't recognize or respect geographic and industry boundaries. Companies that started in the top quintile 10 years earlier soaked up 50 cents of every dollar of new capital in the decade up to 2014. This capital infusion enabled the top performers to grow their average economic profit by more than 130% in real terms over that decade, from $612 million to $1.4 billion, even though their average returns on invested capital stayed relatively constant at around 16%. Even as the curve gets steeper, this is not a permanent inequality. As we will discover during the course of this book, companies and entire industries move up and down the curve. It is uneven, but also very dynamic. A firm's place on the curve changes all the time. Size isn't everything, but it isn't nothing either. In choosing a measure like economic profit, we know that size comes into play. That might create some feelings of discomfort. One might argue that a relative measure, such as economic profit margin or return on invested capital, should be used. But incorporating size in the measure makes sense. We evaluate the strength of a strategy based not only on how powerful its economic formula is, measured by the spread of its returns over its cost of capital, but also on how scalable that formula is, measured by how much invested capital it could deploy. See Exhibit 4. Compare Walmart, with a moderate 12% return on capital but a whopping $136 billion of invested capital, with Starbucks, which has a huge 50% return on capital but is limited by being in a much less scalable category, deploying only $2.6 billion of invested capital. Both are top quintile companies, but which had the better strategy? Well, that's a bit of a moot question, as they both generated enormous value. But the difference in economic profit generation is substantial. $5.3 billion from Walmart versus $1.1 billion from Starbucks. Size has its limitations, too. Larger firms, above average invested capital, make up 80% of all firms in the bottom quintile. If anything, we could say that larger companies are more likely to generate very high or very low economic profit. 28% are in the top quintile, while just 41% of large firms are spread across the middle three quintiles. To say it simply, it is easier to make a big profit or a big loss if you are big. However, it is really the combination of scale and spread that matters. In the end, it's you versus the world. You're used to comparing against your next-door neighbors and your own last 3 years. But it feels different looking at the whole world as it's represented on the power curve. Your horizon gets broadened, and you may be either chastened or emboldened, depending on where you find yourself on the curve. You look at lots of relative data today, but you can now see the whole playing field. This is where companies compete for the eye of the investor in terms of the performance they deliver, relative to all other companies and not relative to their industries. This is where you see how effective strategy is over time in terms of moving companies up and down that curve. Some feel that it's unfair to be compared against companies in other industries and other nations, but that's the comparison that capital makes. It flows to the best opportunities, no matter the industry or geography. Your main competitor is the Darwinian force of the market that squeezes your profitability. Your main measure of whether you are winning is the extent to which you avoid that squeeze. Why you are where you are. Even CEOs and CFOs are often surprised to see where they are on the power curve. It's not that they suffered from delusions, it's just that they're accustomed to an inside view. They compare their performance to peer benchmarks within their immediate competitors, not against the global universe of companies. Some CEOs are surprised to find themselves in the middle. They feel they are on top of their game or their industry. Some CEOs are surprised to find themselves at the very top of the curve and ponder whether it is their task to expand the curve or their fate to slide down. Wherever a company is, the question quickly becomes, why are we there? That question, too, leads to a surprise. The tendency when taking an inside view is that when things are going well, we attribute results to our management's unique recipe. When times are tough, it's an industry problem or bad luck. However, our analysis shows that a good 50% of your positioning on the curve is driven by what's happening in your industry, highlighting that where to play is really one of the most critical choices in strategy. Industry performance, we found, also follows a power curve with the same hanging tail and high leading peak as shown in Exhibit 5. There are 12 tobacco companies in our research, and 9 are in the top quintile. Yet there are 20 paper companies, and none is in the top quintile. Well-known high performers such as software, pharmaceuticals, and wireless telecommunications jostle for position in the top quintile, while utilities, transport, and construction materials lumber along in the bottom quintile. The role of industry in a company's position on the power curve is so substantial that you'd rather be an average company in a great industry than a great company in an average industry. See Exhibit 6. The median pharmaceutical company, India-based Sun Pharmaceuticals, with economic profit of $424 million, the median software company, Adobe Systems, $339 million, and the median semiconductor company, Marvell Technology Group, $277 million, all would be in the top quintile of chemicals companies and the top 10% of food products companies. In some cases, you'd rather be in your supplier's industry than in your own. For example, again in Exhibit 6, the average economic profit of airlines is a loss of $99 million, while suppliers in the aerospace and defense category average a profit of $453 million. In fact, the 20th percentile aerospace and defense supplier, Saab AB, earns more economic profit than the 80th percentile airline, Air New Zealand. That is not to say that all airlines have poor economic performance, witness Japan Airlines, nor that all is rosy in aerospace and defense. But it is a fact of life that there are more and less attractive playing fields. Across the whole market, firms in the top quintile of the power curve get a boost of $335 million of economic profit just from being in better industries, while those in the bottom quintile suffer a penalty of minus $253 million from being in worse industries, as shown in Exhibit 7. There are, of course, exceptions that don't conform to the fates of their industries. For example, companies from integrated telecommunications services, a top quintile industry, are overrepresented in both the top and bottom company quintiles. The same is true for integrated oil and gas, a bottom quintile industry. But when it comes to explaining variance, we find that industry explains somewhere between 40 and 60%. And as industry definition gets more granular, the share of economic profit explained by the industry effect only increases. Even though all strategy presentations we've seen start with an industry view, that view is rarely carried forward to explain past performance. The old wisdom in strategy is that you have to know the real answer to the question, why do I make money? Industry is a much bigger reason than most people understand or want to accept, both on the upside, when tailwinds help us sail along, and on the downside, when the writing on the wall tells us tough times are coming and we don't like the news. Now that we have started drawing our new map and understand the crucial role of industry, let's head back to the strategy room and see what's different. A fresh perspective with the outside view. When you realize that success is very much defined by your company's and your industry's movements on the power curve, your perspective changes. Some companies have a low probability of making it to the top quintile, perhaps because of the industry they're in, but many at least have a shot. If you are aspiring to such a move, you are probably contemplating by now a few intriguing insights. The power curve is a new reference point you might not have used before. You're no longer comparing yourself with last year or your neighbor, but rather the full universe of companies competing for capital and economic profits. Success for your strategy becomes moving up on the power curve. Small success is moving in the middle flatlands. Big success is moving to the top quintile, and the reverse holds true for failure. Your aspirations need calibration. Incremental improvements aren't enough to get you moving because your competitors are also working hard, and thus all your work might yield just a standstill. Moving up on the curve is not a one-year exercise. It is a journey that needs good strategy and sustained execution. The mountain is just too steep at the tails to climb quickly. The billion-dollar question, of course, is, what does it take to move on the power curve? Well, almost $1 billion. As we'll see later, companies that do jump up from the middle quintiles to the top experience an average lift of $640 million in annual economic profit. As we've said, success requires bigger moves than companies typically make. One client CEO traditionally framed discussions around 4 to 6% growth and resourced his divisions accordingly. One year, he did a much more granular analysis, business/country, and realized that one geography, Russia at the time, was growing at 30%. He swamped the Russian operations with resources, created a much more favorable environment, and it ended up growing much faster. The head of the Russian unit remarked, "I knew we could win, it's just that until now we never got the resources we needed, all because we used to just look at averages." Sometimes big success requires even more drastic measures, moving into a more profitable industry, or more favorable industry segments, tough to do. Or, if that's not in the cards, restructuring the economics of your industry to make it more attractive might be your only alternative. In setting strategic goals, most companies see hockey stick plans that rarely deliver the results they aspire to. The curious thing is that all of them are actually looking in the right direction. The way to make a move on the power curve is in fact a hockey stick. The challenge is telling a real one from a fake one. Shortly, we'll get to how you identify real hockey stick plans, but first, let's look at how fake ones are generated and the problems that result. Chapter 3. Hockey Stick Dreams, Hairy Back Realities. Hockey stick plans